It needs to be green. All right, this is the Cortez City Council work session. Today is Tuesday, August 8th, 2023, and the time is 5:47 p.m. I'll call this meeting to order, and we'll start with A on our agenda, the Joint Council and Planning Zoning work session, the Land Use Code Assessment Report. All right. Thank you for being here.
All right, thanks for having us. Well, I think we actually have some introductions coming up, but just for a quick round of introductions, I think we've met most of you. Some of you, we might have been online for the meeting, the Planning Commission meeting that we were juggling. But I'm Jen Gardner with Logan Simpson, and excited to be here tonight.
And I'm Michaela Dunphy, also with Logan Simpson. Nice to see you all.
And we have our housing specialist, Sarah, in the audience as well, so if we have any questions for her as we go, she can certainly jump in. All right, we have a little presentation for tonight. It's kind of part of the discussion, just to have a visual to go through to kind of keep us all on task. But really our main purpose tonight is going to be to go over the Land Use Code Assessment Report that we put together and discuss any questions you have along the way. Any questions about maybe how we arrived at any of the decisions, or if we come across a recommendation and you say, I really think we also need to add this. Please chime in. I just want to keep this very open and kind of discussion-oriented throughout. So just a little reminder of the project team that we've been working with. Like I said, I'm Jen Gardner with Logan Simpson and Michaela here. We have Sarah Brown-McLean from Western Spaces. Willa Williford has been supporting Sarah on the housing plan. And then Nina Williams with Wilson Williams. You haven't probably seen her much yet, but she will be behind the scenes reviewing everything from a legal perspective, just to make sure we're not stepping any legal hot water. And then we've got our wonderful staff from Cortez. And just a reminder of the schedule, we'll always pretty much have this slide in any presentation we do, just to remind us kind of where we're at in the process. And we have wrapped up the foundation, and we're pretty well wrapped up with the assessment now after today. Tonight is kind of the final piece of that assessment report. If there's any edits that come out of this meeting, we'll fine-tune those and get it posted on the website. And after that, we'll dive into drafting Module 1. And just a reminder of our guiding principles from this project are to create a user-friendly code, make sure the right things are easy, so the development that we all collectively feel is the right development for Cortez, make sure that that's the kind of development that can happen. Balancing flexibility and predictability, engaging the public, right-sizing the standards, preserving and enhancing local character, and then responding to housing needs. We have a project website up. We haven't had a whole lot to add to it lately, but we'll continue to, as we have, like I said, the assessment report, that'll get posted up on the website, and any other useful documents. So as you guys are even looking through it, if you think of anything that might be helpful for the whole group, the public, yourselves, please let us know, and we'll make sure we get that on there. Do you have any other updates on that? It's pretty straightforward.
No, other than it's pretty straightforward, accessible from the city's homepage.
Great. Okay, so we're going to do a quick overview of what we heard from the public through our outreach process so far. You'll all remember we did some one-on-one group listening sessions a couple of months ago, and as part of that, we had a session with City Council and one with Planning Commission to ask some questions We've met with city and county residents, planning and zoning board members, city council members, city staff, public, nonprofit project managers, and local business owners. We did meet with a few folks from the development and building community to kind of get their input on applications as we've gone through. And these were the questions that were asked. We were just basically asking what works and what doesn't with the current land use and development code. You know, is it easy to use? What could we do to make it work better? And thinking from the perspective of land use impacts, use standards, zoning and dimensional standards, application procedures, review criteria, and any other additional standards that might be missing. So that was kind of what we were asking folks to provide feedback on, and that feedback really did start to frame the picture for us on this assessment report. It gave us a good list of items to start doing our own research on. And so what we heard, that kind of initial list was an interest in clarifying criteria, so across the board, all application types, just really looking at the criteria for approval, making sure that they're solid and they're easy for staff to review and you all to review, and the applicant, when they're putting forth an application, making sure they've met the criteria first and foremost. More graphics and flow charts. No major issues with the code structure. It does flow chapter-wise fairly well. We heard that from a lot of people, but that it could use just some updates and some, like I said, the graphics tables. There's a few things we've recommended kind of moving around to help out with the overall structure. Better alignment with the comprehensive plan. And actually probably could add to that the housing plan that you're going to be hearing tonight, just making sure that all the plans are consistent and being implemented. Improvements to major and minor subdivision processes, just clarifying, you know, with different types of subdivisions, maybe there's a tiered process where the simpler subdivisions could have a simpler process and the more complicated ones go through the full process. Review of site development standards such as parking, lot dimensions, sidewalks, signage. We did hear actually quite a bit about lot dimensions, and I think we've talked to all of you about that in the past too, that your current minimum lot sizes are kind of constraining with some of the zone districts. So we have that recommendation in here, and you'll hear about that in a little bit. But looking at non-conforming uses, and then there were many concerns around housing affordability. So that's kind of the main list of everything we heard from the public during those listening sessions that really started to kind of tear us off on the assessment process. And then what we did is we took that feedback and started to read through the code ourselves. I won't say we read line by line, but we did a decent review of the current standards to look for things like, okay, if dimensional standards came up several times in those meetings, we looked at the dimensional standards and said, okay, we can kind of see where there might be some issues, so we kind of captured that in a general comment in the assessment report. So the assessment report, like I said, is kind of a mix of all the feedback we've heard so far, our professional opinion, and feedback from staff, and from the recommendations from the Housing Action Plan. So now I'm going to get into each of the kind of sections of the assessment report, and for those of you who have read this, a lot of this will look familiar, just kind of a shorter version, the Cliff Notes version, I say. But generally, just looking through and reducing redundancies. So anywhere that we feel, as we're all looking, you know, going through this drafting process together, as we see, you know, we're seeing redundancies or inconsistencies, we want to clear those up first and foremost. Ensuring purpose and intent statements are consistent, so also ensuring that we have purpose and intent statements consistently throughout all the sections. Improving definitions to clarify content and modernize antiquated terminology. So we'll comb through the definitions, we'll kind of feed through the entire process. So as we go, anytime we're talking about something and we say, oh, that's a definition we don't have in here already, we'll flag it. And when we do a module, we'll have a section at the end always that says additional definitions that we need to consider. And then when we get to the definition section, we'll go through and say, okay, what did we mean by mink farms being something that's not even something we have here, or something like that, and we'll scratch some of those definitions that don't need to be in there. Anytime there are standards that are in the definitions, we'll make sure those are in the right place in the code and not in the definitions, and vice versa. Sometimes there's definitions in the standards that need to move over. So definitions are actually a really big part of the code, and like I said, they kind of happen throughout the whole process, but then they have a special spot at the end where we really dive into them specifically.
And I would just add, we do
Yeah.
have a running list in
Oop.
this.
I'll put this.
We do have a running list in the assessment report right now with terms that need to be defined. So if you see any that are missing or that you think should be in there, please let us know.
Great. Make stronger statements. So where anywhere that there's should or encourage or may, some of those, every once in a while, those are okay in a code, but usually you want to change those into a shall, a little bit stronger language. Or if it's a should or may, sometimes that can go in the purpose statement, speaking to kind of more the general intent or purpose of something, and then have this more strict standards. So anywhere that there's kind of what we call a little bit more of that fluffy language, we'll make sure those are stronger statements. And then add more graphics and tables throughout, which we've mentioned several times. The dimensional standards are really helpful a lot of times to have some graphics for people to see how those are measured. Sign code, oftentimes it's really helpful to see, again, kind of the measurements. Landscaping, a lot of times it's really helpful to see kind of how the parking lot landscaping, some of that text lays out in a visual format. I'm trying to think of anything else. Those are kind of the key ones we always add to codes.
And we've
So-
got examples, images in the assessment report that you can take a look at as well.
Any questions on the general recommendations?
Yeah. I'm curious, like number 4, because I've always wondered, like, when is it more appropriate to be like, this is required versus may? When are situations where you use may?
So that's a great question. In code, you should very rarely use may. The only times I would say it's okay to use may is if let me try to think of a good example. Let's use, I'm just going to use a real obvious example, like a landscape plan or something. If it's, if we really want parking lot islands with trees in them, instead of saying, you may place a tree in the parking lot island, if we really want the trees in the islands, then we need to say, you shall. Where the may could come in is, you may get a waiver from that requirement if you meet certain requirements, which kind of opens the door for an opportunity for flexibility there. But usually I would say the standard should be set, and the may is more of a, you may waive this or something along those lines.
Okay.
So very rarely, I would say, our rule of thumb is typically may language leaves too much discretion, so trying to peel that out as much as possible.
So to stick with that may
Yeah.
and shall
Yeah.
thing, how do you handle that with like conditional uses? How do you address that?
So conditional uses are the more tricky. With conditional uses, what I like to see is a nice set of criteria that lead you to make a decision without discretion. So conditional uses should not be well, we're not really sure if this is right, and I'm going to decide whether I like it or not. It should be, what are the impacts? So, is this going to impact noise, air quality? It's usually kind of those higher type of impacts. And those should be in the code somewhere so that when a conditional use application comes in, you're able to compare it against those kind of criteria rather than, well, I'm not sure if this fits in.
So the idea would be a conditional use is an allowed use with mitigations, and that,
Yes.
and that
Yes.
sort of is how that flows. Okay.
Yep. And actually, a lot of cities and counties in Colorado specifically, every state handles conditional use different. We have a lot of, we don't have a lot of legislature on that, so it's nice because we can kind of set that at a community level. But a lot of communities are trying to pull away from conditional uses as much as possible and having standards for those uses. So for example, an industrial use is a great example. So maybe you have a light industrial and a heavy industrial, and you define kind of what those different, what makes them different, and then how you would mitigate those impacts would be standards right there in that use. And then you look at that against your zone districts and you say, it makes sense here, here, and here. And this is the one where we're not quite sure. It could go or it could not go depending on how they meet those requirements. And that's where it becomes a conditional use. So, but it's still meeting those standards. So that can really help clarify conditional uses and reduce the reliance on them. So, absolutely. Any other questions on general recommendations?
I guess mine is broadly about like zoning. So, I'm assuming that we're keeping the zoning that we have and we're kind of figuring out like, well, how do we tweak the uses of each of these zonings to like accommodate the community? But I mean, what is the threshold where like, okay, most of our parcels in that are non-conforming and the recommended, changes to that zone or uses still don't match what's going on there? Is there ever a rezone? Do you ever like rezone or change the boundaries of the zones?
Yes. A great example, Wellington, Colorado, up in the northern Front Range, they had a situation somewhat similar to you, but a little bit different. They had never really defined kind of a downtown core, and their comprehensive plan really spoke to the neighborhood around the downtown. They really wanted to be different than some of the other areas. And they didn't have a specific zone district for it. They had this transitional zone district, which left a ton of discretion. And so they actually, through the comprehensive plan, defined the downtown area and then the downtown neighborhood, which would be kind of that layer right next to it, and then the additional kind of neighborhood outside of that. So it's kind of a tiered approach. And then when we did the code update, we rolled that into a new zone district and kind of tweaked those zone districts right around the downtown, and they did do a full rezone map. After the code was updated, then they rezoned those parcels, met with all the property owners, and made sure that those, and it really was spurred on by the property owners for the most part that wanted to be in that kind of downtown neighborhood character to preserve the character. So yes, that could be a result of this. We don't have any strong recommendations at the moment on that. I think at this moment what we've identified is there is definitely a lot of non-conforming parcels, and just that's part of what we'll have to workshop when we get to the zone districts, which is in our first module, I believe, so we can hit that first. I think we really need to address zoning and uses together and see where those are, and like you said, if it comes down to we either need to change a zone district or add a new zone district and rezone some parcels, then we can talk about that.
Okay.
So,
Thank
yeah.
you.
All right. Any other questions on that one? All right, here's just some examples of a huge variety of graphics and tables we've done for other codes. And as you can see, the landscaping is pretty popular. The lower left-hand corner is a sign code graphic. We've done everything from color graphics to black and white. And we'll just kind of work up a couple styles. And Michaela actually is our graphics guru, so she'll create kind of a Cortez look and feel for the graphics. We'll use some of the same kind of elements of some of our graphics, but we try to make them a little bit different for every code so that they're really specific to your whole code. Same with tables. They'll get formatted throughout the whole code. However we decide we want to kind of format the final document, they'll fit within that. You already have quite a few tables, so a lot of codes don't have a lot of tables, and you guys already do. There's just a few other places that could it could help the legibility of it to put some of that language in tables.
Making sure that like if the table's split between two pages,
Yes.
the header is...
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
That is a good one. All right, chapter 1 is a pretty simple chapter. It's just the general, I shouldn't say just the general provisions. This is actually a very important chapter, which kind of sets out the introduction of the whole code. We do want to look, this is where the non-conforming standards are right now, and we do want to look at those. Like we were just talking about with the zone districts, I think once we address the zone districts and uses, then we can come back into the non-conforming uses and structures and see where we still need to address standards. But one of the things that we've talked about is the threshold for maintenance and repairs of non-conforming uses. I believe it's based on market value right now. A lot of communities are going to a square footage, a percentage of square footage, which is a lot easier to administer across the board. So that's one recommendation that we do have, is maybe looking at changing that threshold. And we can talk about the pros and cons of that when we get into it and figure out our best approach for that. Rebuilding of non-conforming uses should be limited to specific areas within the city, such as downtown. Again, back to that Wellington example, they had some residential uses in their kind of commercial downtown area, and they were very aware of that over time those will transition to commercial, but those property owners would like to hold on to those properties for now. And if, say, the whole house burns down, they didn't want to have to rebuild it as a commercial property. So we did write in a stipulation, and it is legal in the state of Colorado, that you can create kind of a clause in there that if your property is demolished or whatever, that you can rebuild. So in certain circumstances. So we could look at some language like that that would help preserve some of those properties that might be in a kind of in that crosshairs of nonconformity. And then right now your code violations are a misdemeanor, and we'd like to change that to a civil offense. So that's pretty much it for chapter 1. The rest of it is fairly straightforward. I mean, there's always going to be some, what's the word I'm looking for? Just some language tweaks, just making sure it flows well and is reading well. So, but those are the major things. Any other questions on that? All right. Chapter 2 is currently the rules of construction, definitions, and interpretations. As Michaela said, we'll be maintaining a list of, and we already kind of have started a list of definitions right now, but we'll maintain that list throughout. We've talked about maybe moving the defined uses to chapter 3 with the other use standards, and we can kind of discuss that a little bit more when we get into this first module, but there's pros and cons to all of this, right? And a lot of communities, we've been kind of working with this approach, and a lot of communities do really like it, where you have your use table, and then you go into the use standards right after that, and they're alphabetical in the same order as the use table, and you would actually define the term and then have any standards, and then define the next term and have any standards. Then it's all right there. You see your use table, you go down, you see the definition and the standards, rather than flipping back and forth between the definitions. Some people really like just keeping everything that's defined in the definition. So it's kind of a, we'll just have to kind of maybe look at a couple different options and decide which way we want to go. But our initial recommendation is just to consider moving those defined terms, use terms, all into the use chapter. And then ensure standards are not buried within definitions, which we've talked about. So any questions about this one? All right. Chapter 3 is the zone district regulations. This is probably one of the chapters that's going to need the most work. As we've talked about, we want to look at the zone districts in general, but renaming the area regulations. Right now they're called area regulations, and a lot of us look at them as dimensional standards, so just retitling that. Moving those dimensional standards into a table so it's really easy to see, and you can see all the zone districts together. So maybe you have a parcel that's unzoned and you want to see what makes the most sense, or you want to kind of compare. Maybe you're looking at a rezone, or just to be able to see all of that together. Again, we've already kind of talked about this, but changing any dimensional standards that could reduce some of those nonconformities. So we've already started. We've pulled everything into a table right now, all of your dimensional standards, all of your uses, and we're starting to kind of be able to cross-reference things. So as we start to move into Module 1, we can all look at those together and say, well, here's some examples of other communities. Here's what you have. Here's some of the applications we've seen. Here's some of the constraints we've seen. So we'll just it's just really kind of workshopping it to find the right solution at that point.
I'm just thinking, we probably have a lot of really small lots, and even if they're still smaller than the minimum lot size, it'd be really hard to accommodate, okay, you can only take up 40% of your lot, and you have to meet these setbacks. And so I've realized that might be where the variance comes into play, which we'll still need a variance process. I think this reduces that hopefully a lot, but I guess will that kind of address maybe non-conforming?
Yes.
Okay.
Our hope is that we can, and like I said, we've just started to scratch the surface too, but as we really start to analyze the lot sizes and the needs and the housing needs, I feel like we're going to kind of all come to we just need to reduce to this or this, and I think we're going to be able to accommodate a lot of it. That said, we're always, like you said, we're always going to still have some non-conforming lots, but, and we were actually just talking right before this work session about different housing types, and that's the other thing that the housing needs assessment and housing action plan, kind of speak to some different housing types, looking at tiny homes or small homes, cottage courts, some of these other different kinds of housing types, just making sure that they're able to be accommodated. They don't necessarily need to be spelled out as a requirement of any kind, but making sure that there aren't any barriers in the code to accommodating, a variety of different housing types as we move forward. So, any other questions on that one? There will be some reorganization in this chapter too. The way that the language flows right now, I think some reconsolidation and reorganization will help kind of ease of use of this chapter. But I think this will be one of the chapters that you'll see quite a different face when it comes out, when we get done with it. All right. Chapter 4 is the subdivision standards. Like we talked about earlier, kind of looking at a minor versus major subdivision process, adding subdivision improvement agreement standards to make that a little bit clearer. Adding language on bonding for improvements. That one's always a fun one. We'll get Nina involved in that from a legal perspective, but there's several different ways we can go with that, and we'll just kind of have some discussions and figure out the best approach to that. Yeah.
Sorry, is that going to include like vested rights? Because I've never quite understood that, but.
Gotcha. So bonding is a little different than the vested rights, but we can include vested rights in here. I believe state statute already, there's a 3-year vesting, and I think that's a state statute. I can't remember off the top of my head, but a lot of codes will also just include language on vesting of property rights. So we can talk about that, yeah. Review street standards and add some graphics in that section. Especially when we were talking to Public Works and Engineering, they said there's a lot of, from their review perspective, still kind of some ambiguity that makes it very hard for them to review applications. So kind of leaning on them to guide us with some of the standards that would really help make things go a little bit smoother from that perspective. Enhancing easement language, just making it really clear, where you need to have an irrigation easement on some of your irrigation canals, what that means. Looking at, utility easements, right-of-way dimensions. Review and update public land dedication language. So we always review that just to see if it's still working. We haven't dove into that in any detail yet, so that's more of a kind of a flag for us to remember to just look at that, make sure that it's serving the community well. Because some communities, they're finding that they really have a lot of the park amenities that they need, so we need to look at a different type of open space dedication or changing that a little bit. One of the big ones that came out of, again, kind of talking with Public Works was some drainage standards. There are a couple of priority drainage ways, especially out kind of on the east side of town, where some development hasn't occurred, but it looks like development could start to kind of encroach in that area. And some standards that would preserve those drainage ways. There's kind of a very large drainage, actually, that runs through that area. And we don't want to impact stormwater negatively, so we want to make sure that the code starts to look at some of those drainage ways and maybe even look at some low-impact development standards to kind of help mitigate stormwater management. So that might be one of the newer things that would go into the subdivision standards. A lot of this other stuff is just kind of tweaking and adding clarification. Sorry. No, you're great. I love it.
So I don't know if this is the right section, but like dedicating right-of-way, I think there's been confusion too, like, okay, we have a master streets plan. Mm-hmm. And so then say someone makes a subdivision and then they dedicate the right-of-way to the city, well, we're not ready to take it. Like, I think there needs to be a clear process of like, well, this is how you dedicate it, this is what it means, and then when the city's ready to claim that and have a road and maintain it, or whatever, in that right-of-way, what that looks like. I think there's not really clarity on that.
Okay. And then maintenance of any improvements
Yeah.
before the city is
Right.
ready to take that on?
And then, because there's issues with platted subdivisions where infrastructure wasn't built, it wasn't bonded.
Right.
Who's in charge of building those roads? I want, that to be clear for future subdivisions. And I think the other question is, how many lots have to be on board, and I don't know if that's relevant for future things, but, previous ones.
Okay. That sounds good. Any other questions on the subdivision standards? Or anything you feel we're missing, or?
Do we reference wetlands or floodplain or,
Yeah,
in terms of drainage?
yeah, actually, wetlands is a great one. You do have a whole section on floodplain regulations, which is more specific to FEMA floodplain, FEMA-identified floodplains. And we've done a quick read through. It looks decent. We have a couple comments in here, I think. But wetlands is a great one. I don't think I remember seeing anything on kind of natural resource protections or wetlands. And a lot of communities want to put some sort of buffering standards on wetlands and waterways. So if that's something you think we should contemplate, I think we could add that in. Okay.
I think I have a question about number
Yeah.
6, public land dedication.
Yeah.
What's the current language like, and what's sort of the proposed? Have you gone down that path at all?
So I know in the housing needs assessment that it's also noted there, and as specifically to revisit the required 5%. So that's the current language, or fee in lieu.
Yeah, I just, and this is a general sort of question, I don't know how much that's used currently. I think in the past it was used a lot more, and so there's that kind of cash in lieu idea maybe that might be used a little bit more often than the public land dedications. I just don't know how much effort or time we want to put in on that. Maybe the changes will make it, easier for people to do that, or maybe it'll make more sense for the city, but I feel like, personally, we've got a lot of really nice parks, but it's acreage to take care of.
Right. Right.
Well, and also we don't want to be taking care of all these little pieces throughout every subdivision. Because, when you say public land, is that land dedicated to the city, or does that include the school district? Because I imagine they feel the same way.
Yeah.
I think back in the day, you needed land dedicated to, government and schools, but we're not really at that place anymore.
Yeah, I believe it does include school dedication, and a lot of communities are going to just a dollar amount for school dedication for that purpose, because they used to want land dedicated, and like you said, now they're very particular about where they want the school, and rather than, this developer wants to dedicate this land, but it's not where we want it, they can work that out. So the open space is a little more tricky, and I will flag that to talk to Nina, talk about that with, my words are jumbled there. You get the picture. But I believe we do need to set a standard for the open space to allow the fee in lieu, because I don't think you can just have a fee for the open space. I think it has to be a standard, and then you can do the fee in lieu, realizing a lot of people probably will choose the fee in lieu path. I think we still need to look at that. And if we want to change the standard, if we want to increase it, we would need to do a study similar to what we did with the housing needs assessment, kind of a needs or a nexus type study. So just keep that in mind. But we can definitely look at it, and we can look at the language and kind of spur that on and see if that's something that needs to happen. So, and then with public land, I think you started to bring that up. In some codes, it talks, where there's pocket parks, and there's the neighborhood parks, and there's the regional parks, and a lot of people don't want to maintain the smaller parks. So kind of looking at that whole hierarchy and figure out what really is needed in Cortez. So I know through our, this gets a little bit more specific than the code. I think this would be more something that would have to come from the comprehensive plan, but in our listening sessions, we heard about, and you all are aware of this, I'm sure, the wonderful park we have behind us, versus kind of a lack of that amenity on the south side of the highway. So again, the code can't really get as specific as to say if you're in this area, you need this type of dedication. But just kind of keep that in mind. That is something that we heard about that maybe some other policy document would want to address in the future. So, all right. Chapter 5, site development standards. Again, this chapter might be similar to the zone districts. I think there could be some new standards that get introduced to this chapter. Parking requirements are a big one. Just looking, every community we're working in, parking is probably one of the primary issues that comes out as, the standard is too high, either commercial applicants are having a hard time meeting the requirement, or they're meeting the requirement and we're left with a sea of asphalt that we're not using. So vice versa with housing, a lot of people, or a lot of communities have been reducing those requirements or allowing offsets, incentive to do a certain type of housing. We might reduce the parking, and then we're seeing that there's not enough parking because we do live in Colorado and people like to have their vehicles to get out and play. So it's kind of a big balance with parking. There is no silver bullet answer that I have found. We have done a ton of research. Every community, there's always someone pushing the envelope on parking. So we'll keep that fresh and alive with you all as we move through this. And any new ideas that are coming out that communities are trying, we'll put forth and we'll kind of talk through how we want to address that. I will say a lot of people are dropping their required minimums to a lower number, and then some people are not even having a minimum and putting in a maximum. So that's kind of the trend across the country right now. And then with housing, I think there's one stipulation in the code where it requires a certain number of parking per bedroom or per unit. Do you remember which one that one was?
For all residential types, there is a requirement for 2 parking spaces. And I think there's one exception for housing occupied by the elderly, which I believe is then 1.5.
Okay. So, looking at that, if it's a studio apartment that might only have 1 vehicle, maybe we only need 1. So just using common sense, we'll kind of start to whittle away at the parking regulations. Define or remove the term single-family equivalent in lieu of a specific unit count. So again, that's speaking to the terminology in the code, just clarifying that, being a little more direct and specific about that. There was a couple comments throughout the process about non-compliant gravel parking becoming compliant. So that's, again, one of those areas where we can try to find a trigger. And if you modify a certain percentage of the building, we can say now you need to pave that space or something. So we can kind of look at some triggers for improvements. You can do that with sign code, lighting, landscaping, paving, sidewalks, some of those types of things. Widen sidewalk width minimums. So I realize a lot of sidewalks are already in, but any new development, I believe the sidewalk minimum is, I can't remember if it's 4 or 5 feet, but it's fairly narrow. So we're going to look at maybe a little bit wider sidewalk widths. The fencing height, this one was kind of funny. I think it was typically your residential maximum height is like 6 feet and commercial is 8. Yours is 8 or 7 for commercial and 8 for resident. It's kind of flip-flops. So we want to make some consistency there. So I think we'll probably stick with 8 feet across the board just after looking at that. But
one thing I did want to consider, well, first sidewalks.
Yep.
One of the big issues in our community is it's not very walkable because we don't have consistent sidewalks. And yeah, we want new development to put them in, but how do we, incentivize adding in sidewalks? Could that be hand in hand with parking? Like, okay, we'll reduce your parking if you put in a sidewalk? I don't know. Or, I don't know how else you incentivize it instead of enforce it.
That's a really good question. I think you're on the right track with maybe some incentives to try to give and take something in there. We'll put our heads together on that and see if we can come up with some good ideas, because you're right. That's one thing we've noticed being in town is it's not super walkable, especially along the highway. But But yeah, and we heard that from a lot of people in our listening sessions was just, some neighborhoods are more walkable, but the connectivity between them is difficult. And it is hard to retroactively get sidewalks in, but people do it. So maybe we can look at a way to bring some incentives or some standards in.
Or like, could we focus on like those connectivity roads too, like those through roads that, like, okay, if you remodel this much, like we're going to require you put in a sidewalk then or something.
Absolutely.
Because I can think of the main streets that need sidewalks.
Right. Yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of times it comes down to the city kind of partnering on some of that too.
Which we do have a concrete cost share.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would help.
Yeah, I was wondering about grants in terms of like, some of the neighborhoods where you walk down a sidewalk and then all of a sudden there's no sidewalk for like the next two. So surely there's some like walkable city type grants or.
Yeah, no, there's
something
the
like
Safe
that
Route to
that's out there.
Schools, which we've gotten before or
'Cause
something.
I think you're right, the cost
Yeah.
share is great, I think it's super generous, and also at the same time, I think there's some people who just are like, nah,
Right.
Yeah, it's still expensive.
not doing it.
Yeah. And then in terms of fence, I think that there's a unique situation along the highway, whether that be 491 or 145. Especially on 145, those houses are kind of well above the road. So, I think naturally I would be like, oh yeah, you can build an 8-foot fence instead of 6 because you want to block out the highway. That's a unique place, but you don't want a wall of fences around the city.
Right.
It's a balance. But
Absolutely.
maybe like unique places that, may require, or, 2 different zonings that are adjacent,
Right.
could allow a bigger fence or, some nuances, I don't know.
Yeah. You bring up actually a good point too, kind of the highways that you mentioned where property's back to them and maybe the property wants to mitigate some of the noise. Right now, I don't believe you have any particular kind of sound mitigating or sound barrier type standards. Those are typically seen more along like an interstate or a bigger highway, but is that something that you might want to investigate at all, where people could have a heavier sound barrier, not required, but could be allowed to have a heavier, taller, more opaque? I don't know. Is that something that you would want to see? Anyone, or kind of just keep it?
I don't think it hasn't come up as an issue.
Okay,
It has, yeah.
okay,
Mostly on like 184,
Or 145.
145.
145, yeah.
Yeah, across from the golf course where those houses
Yeah.
are above and.
Yes, okay. Okay,
Worth the conversation.
yeah, well, yeah, we can bring it up and kind of bring some sample type standards to the table and see if we want to bring that forward or not.
But like Mayor said, we don't want to sacrifice quality of life for,
Right,
individual sound barriers having a wall.
yeah, exactly. Okay. Let's see, reorganize landscape section into some more subsections for clarity. I think there's some good stuff in the landscape section right now, but the way it's organized, it's kind of unclear. And like we said before, some graphics and just a little bit more clarity in that section. And in addition, adding some buffer language requirements between residential and commercial. And I think we were kind of just talking about that even with the fencing, having some more standard requirements between residential and commercial. Could help kind of mitigate the impacts, so.
So is it currently 10% that's required for commercial building, for landscaping, I think?
I believe so. I'm going to look over at Nancy.
I think
Yes,
so.
okay.
Anyway, I know that we have sort of a recommended list of different plants, as part of that 10% for that. Have you seen anywhere, maybe this is too radical, run out on a rail, but have you seen anywhere where they say something like, half of that needs to be xeric, or
Yes.
something along those lines? Because the cost is negligible, right? Like it's the same, it's probably more expensive to put a non-xeric plant in than it would be definitely long-term. Have you seen that before?
I have. We've seen that. We've seen some communities are kind of doing a tiered system where they'll say a certain percentage needs to be, what we've been doing is, or what we've seen and been doing is under a certain water requirement. So you can look at kind of 3 tiers of water requirement. You've got your heavy water requirement, like your lawns, your turf lawns. Kind of a moderate water requirement might be some of the shrubs and grasses and perennials that do take a little bit more water, and then more of your xeric. And then you could even have a 4th tier that's like truly native, may need some water to establish, but after that, no water. And what we've been doing is restricting kind of that high end, say, you can only have 10% at that high or moderate level or something. So that's one way we've done it. Another way is in tandem with that, having some incentives for going the extra mile. So,
How do people feel about that? Yeah, sorry.
I really like that idea, Matt. I like this tiered system also, with then having some more like incentivized ways of saving water. And it seems like the community responds well to our like water campaign, and not necessarily going like a tisk fine way, more of like a positive messaging.
good. Well, and we'll take a look at that list. We have landscape architects in-house that can take a quick look at the approved list you have right now, and even kind of add those tiers into it so that it's clear. When you are doing an application, you can see, I'm picking plants from tier 4, tier 3, tier 2. Whatever.
And the land use code that we attempted to pass that failed, I remember it having an extensive section about landscaping, because I think a citizen or advocacy group had come and with a lot of good advice. And so I'd like to see that, I guess, in case we can take parts of it or all of it, or
Okay.
hopefully we still have a
But I
copy
think
of it.
like it's good. I like the idea of tiered system too, because it still gives people choice. And I think that people in this community really appreciate having choice versus
And if you'll
limited
notice, I
options.
think a lot of the commercial businesses like Ziggy's and places like that that are coming in, they're already doing it. Because either they know it's the right thing to do, or they know in the long term it's gonna save money. Right, like, I don't think it's too much of a stretch, especially with the tiered system, to make a choice.
Yeah. Back to the sidewalks, I feel like this sidewalk issue is just a constant brain teaser for me. Speaking of ways we could incentivize that, would it be appropriate to create almost like a zoning that connects different neighborhoods, like you're in whatever sidewalk zone, walkability zone, that like, so to somehow incentivize that? And then is there any way to take, like we're talking about that land dedication, I was just thinking, and there, you can do that fee in lieu of, I'm like, what if that sort of thing got flipped into something towards sidewalks within those zones?
I think that's a good idea to explore. In fact, when we were talking earlier, I was thinking of trails, but, maybe, because I know trails can definitely fall in that camp. So if trails can, why can't sidewalks and, other types of paths? So we'll definitely look into that and see if that might be a way we can kind of tie those together. I haven't seen it done directly that I can think of, but that doesn't mean it's not done. And I know sometimes kind of up in the Pacific Northwest, they do some really creative things. So we can look at kind of, they're always like a little bit out on the edge, so we can always kind of look and see what they've been doing successfully. So great. Any other questions on this one? Like I said, organizationally, I don't think you're going to see a huge difference, but I think this is where we're going to start to infuse with some newer standards. And we'll definitely try to get a hold of I've glanced at the previous code in hard copy. Some people have shown it to me, but I haven't actually digested a copy. So if we can get a hold of the landscape standards, we can kind of compare that and see what we can pull in.
I just have a question for the mayor.
Yeah.
Would now be a good time to bring up our proposed walking path around the city, because we're talking about walking and trails that we put in a couple years ago, or not?
So a few years ago, Jim and I talked about like routes around the city, like the best route to hit all the parks. you know, and maybe that we turn that into the district or zone that like Lydia's talking about with, you know, these are where we really want to focus our efforts on getting sidewalks.
Right, and this was before either of us were in our current positions, and in her previous position, the mayor printed out maps of these possible walking areas, so I don't know if letting them take a look at that makes sense at this time for, you know, proposed walks around town, walk A, walk B, what have you. And that map is currently sitting with Parks and Rec at the moment. I
Okay,
believe.
and I think I have a digital copy still.
Okay, and so maybe if you pass that along, that might help in this area.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great, because if there's certain areas, different, you know, the best way to do this is have a Parks and Recreation master plan or Trails master plan that it's identified on that we can reference in the code and say, you know, per X document, this was a priority, and then kind of to Lydia's point, you know, then that becomes maybe a zone district or not a zone district, an overlay or some sort of priority space that now we can tie to the code. So, okay, I think that could work. Great. Let's see, yeah, Parks and Recreation master plans and transportation master plans are, I always find a very key component to tie, you know, to tie the code language to, so, in addition to comprehensive plans. Additionally, there might be a little bit of cleanup in the sign code language. As I recall, I think it was actually in pretty decent shape. We just want to make sure it's compliant with federal, you know, regulations and content neutral. There's been a lot of discussion about the billboards, so we're going to take a look at that. We might rename those off-premise signs, which is what they are, but right now I don't have anything more specific than, I think that the general consensus is to not allow new billboards, but what do we do to kind of keep and maintain the existing billboards and make that clear in the code? So, adding a subsection, do you have something on the signs?
Well, I guess I'll wait till you get to lighting, because
Okay.
it's like light up signs.
Yes, so lighting, or lighting is the other thing, just making sure that, you know, we're providing the right balance of standards. So if we want to infuse it with a little bit more dark sky type lighting, we can. There's kind of a dark sky light that we've been preparing for some codes, which gets you in the direction. You don't have to go full dark sky compliant, or we can go full dark sky. So we can kind of just, you know, look through that and see where we're at and where we want to be on any lighting standards. So, and then lighting with signage, we can clarify that too.
Is there a plan
Yeah.
for replacing some of the, let me say, outdated street lights?
I have no idea.
I think are all our streetlights CDOT managed?
I don't think so.
Our streetlights are, some are CDOT, yeah, and for the most part they are.
Okay. But David reminds me of a good point of like crosswalks and lighted crosswalks.
Okay.
Some of the lights that have, I say recently, within the last 5 or 10 years, been of the old style. I think, I don't know where the source is, but
Okay.
I think some of them should be updated.
Have you guys been replacing bulbs with LEDs at all, or just?
Yes, I can speak to
Okay.
that since it happened in my neighborhood.
Okay.
They replaced, and so we're talking about neighborhood lights, not on the highways now, but they replaced the old style lights with LEDs, and apparently we do have a dark sky contract with Empire Electric, but the LEDs were like 10 times brighter than the old lights, and so it was actually more offensive to have the new LEDs in there, which are so brilliant, even though they're downcast, than the old lights, so it's quite a mix in the neighborhoods.
Yeah, I would like to see something that is moving more towards promoting dark sky, whether that's requiring like a cover on an outdoor light. Like I used to have a neighbor that had the new LED lights with no cover, and it would literally like come into our house like high beams. Promoting, oh goodness, I lost oh, there's some signs in residential neighborhoods that are LED and like those flashing signs that change. Let's see. Yeah.
And since you mentioned that, yes, I had to have Empire Electric put a shield on the LED light
Okay.
after they changed it. The old one was not that offensive, the new one, they put a shield on there, which is a dark sky shield. So
Okay.
it's possible for them to do that. But
Right.
I would like to see something addressed like that.
Okay.
I think one of the things is really important. Is that working? Is it even working? No.
I
I thought you
I
did.
think I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Right
On,
on it. I think that the thing that we really need to keep in mind, I'm just going to put this out there, is that if we're going to be asking developers to make sure that they have, you know, dark sky compliant lighting, then as a city, we need to make sure that we're dark sky compliant as well. So, I mean, that, you know, sort of hypocrisy thing, it just doesn't fly, especially here. So I'm just going to put a check mark by that.
And again, along those same lines, and something we've had come up before P&Z, it's one thing to have a dark sky ordinance, but we also have a code that says your light shall not leave your property and create glare. Well, that's not enforced, that's everywhere. You can go around here at many commercial institutions where their lights escape there. So I don't know how you do that, again, without a shield of some sort. So you can have dark sky, but if it illuminates everybody on all four sides of you, that defeats the purpose too.
Right.
Well, I feel like that is a good point too, Jim, where like the clarification of language can help a lot, because you know, it's like, well, your light shouldn't leave your property. Well, it's like, okay, what are some ways you can stop that? What does that exactly mean? Like things like those graphs and visuals, I think would be helpful in that instance. And yeah, I agree, Matt, if we want to move towards that, I also agree that the city needs to also take those steps.
And
I think, I was just going to say, I think before we make a sweeping decision like that, we need to measure that against safety. I know it's really cool to see the stars at night, but I also see a lot of people complaining about increased crime, and I had a customer have an accident with a pedestrian in the middle of the street at 9 o'clock at night, and so I think safety needs to be measured against that as well.
And since you bring up measuring, we don't have an effective way to measure lighting right now. Because before I got in this position, I was asking about that. We don't have a way to measure it. So we can say that we do this, but it's just, again, your word against mine if it actually, so a measurement is a very good suggestion.
Yep. Great.
Yeah, I think finding that balance is key. And then also, I think we all are for the dark skies, especially Mesa Verde and Hovenweep, on either side of us, are dark sky designated. But I think it's too soon to say, like, okay, everyone has to be dark sky compliant, but how do we kind of inch towards that goal?
Right. Good.
Okay, and then the lighted signs, I was just thinking about, because there's a citizen who's been complaining about their neighbor having a lighted sign and it's lit up through the middle of the night. And I feel like we've never been able to address their issue, with the current code we have. And so like maybe if their business doesn't operate 24/7, like a motel or a hotel, can we restrict the time that their lighted sign can be on, or the way it faces, or?
Okay. That's a good one.
I wonder if that could be some type of buffering between residential and commercial too, with mentioning the signs and when they can be, and I don't know, like how places have quiet hours, but light.
Yeah, and I think that ties into the next one as well, the noise performance standards. I know the state statutes specify for residential and commercial and industrial, but how do we address that when they butt against each other?
Yep. Yeah, and that's a good segue. So we have a couple different options with noise. We can just adopt the state, just reference the state statute, which is it's pretty well defined. Like you said, like the residential and commercial and different times of day and different things like that. Some communities actually adopt a noise ordinance, a decibel rating, specific decibel rating. We have seen in a lot of the use standards, 70 decibels is kind of a maximum for a lot of the industrial type uses that you might want to place in the code. So even if we reference the state statute for kind of an overall noise ordinance, we can still come through some of those uses and define some very specific noise requirements or standards if we want to. But then again, it is enforcement. So.
Yeah, exactly. So aren't there some current standards that are out there? I mean, that we have for noise? Am I wrong? I mean, we don't have nothing.
I mean, there's state law, the state statute. I don't know that Cortez has anything more
I
specific.
guess I was under the impression that the city of Cortez did actually have, but I'm not advocating anything except just to kind of reiterate what you just said, that I think that especially with everything that we just talked about, enforcement and the price tag that goes along with enforcement is going to be the issue when it comes down to brass tacks. So all these things would be great, like big picture, but at some point we're also going to have to sit down and be like, are we going to have to hire someone in enforcement with PD and then train them to do this thing? And are we going to have decibel meters and cop cars and make sure that we train those guys to be able to use it correctly when a loud vehicle goes down the street? Just being realistic about it. These are all things that I absolutely 100% agree with, and they cost money, is what I'm saying.
Right. I think there's going to have to be a balance there, Matt, where there's certain things that are enforceable and certain things, like we're not going to live in a police state in Cortez with decibel readers and light odometers and whatever. But at the same time, I do feel like I hear from the public a lot that it's very inconsistent in our enforcement, so it may be something that we need to consider as we do this, is the cost of consistent enforcement.
Well, I think that's key, Matt, is we have a lot of code requirements, but, huh? Okay. But without proper code enforcement, which requires additional personnel, we're kind of treading water. So that.
It was taken away from the police department due to code enforcement. So we do have to code enforcement officers. We do have a disturbing piece which talks about noise. And it's very arbitrary on how to enforce that. Like you have a roofer running all night long on a truck. Is that enforceable as a disturbing piece? And so law enforcement, it's very arbitrary for them to go in and write a ticket for a light that protrudes too far from the property. And if I understand that, you're doing the land use code in the civil rather than the criminal. So we're taking it out of the police hands and they go right into code enforcement.
Well, I think, I was just going to say, I feel like that's where it should be. And I think one thing I like that we do in the city is with like weeds and things, where we leave people like a note that's like, hey, you need to take care of your yard. And then I've heard from multiple people that they then get like a thank you. And it, it doesn't feel like this sort of authoritative thing.
And on this whole issue, just take a look at, is there any way to incentivize people who are already exceeding that to come into conformance? Not by mandating them or anything, but in some sort of incentive to make places that are exceeding it to come into conformance.
And just to reference the current performance standards, they are a bit ambiguous. The language is a noise of such intensity as to create a nuisance or detract from the use and enjoyment of adjacent property. So that's currently in the code right now.
That's pretty subjective.
Right, I think one of the biggest ones I hear of noise being an issue is with special events. So, if you have a commercial or industrial use, you're kind of, that's been there, I mean, you'll hear of it sometimes, but that becomes kind of, it's a common use and a known use versus someone who's having a special event, a wedding or a concert or something, and then that's where it really comes into play, where we can set a standard and say, beyond the property line, you need to keep your decibel rating at such and such. And then that helps with the enforcement too, because those are going to be kind of few and far between kind of enforcement calls. But that's where we hear about it all the time in the code world, is those special events that there's just an unusual circumstance, you know, at a time. So, all right, and then let's see, incorporate illustrative graphics in our photos just to help with the technical language, because this whole Chapter 5 section is a lot of, like we've all been talking about tonight, a lot of very technical language, you know, something as simple as with the lighting, you know, showing what full cutoff means and what that means. You know, downward directed means one thing, but, you know, if we're really fully cutting that off, what does that mean? What does that look like? And then light trespass that we were talking about, you know, how you don't want your light to trespass onto the adjacent property. How does that really look in kind of a visual? So some of those kinds of things can be really helpful. Any other questions on that?
Let me just ask you something really quick.
Yeah.
Is there also something about lighting the height of poles?
Yes.
So look at that, because the higher the pole, the more it spreads out, and you might be able to get away with a brighter lighting on a shorter pole than a 20 or 30-foot pole. So I've seen that in other places that I've been on P&Z.
Yeah.
So
Yep, we can look at
pole
that.
height as well.
All right. Chapter 6, administration and procedures. So this is where all the application procedures are. One of the big things that we have proposed for this, that we've done for a lot of codes, is adding a decision-making matrix at the beginning. So that would have all your applications down one side, and then, you know, planning commission, city council staff across the top, and then kind of who makes the recommendation, who makes the decision, and then we can even pair with that the notification requirements. So, you know, is it a mailed notification, a posted notification? Just check boxes so that it's, so an applicant can come in and say, okay, I'm doing a site development plan, this is kind of who's approving it, here's my notification process, and then here's the section, you know, the link to the standards, and then it links you down to, here's my actual procedure. So I think that helps out a lot with kind of summarizing all of that information, because this is a really text-intensive chapter. Add general procedures section, so anywhere that we see repetition in these application procedures, if we see the same thing repeated again and again and again, we can say, let's pull all that up to a general procedure. So your pre-application meeting looks like this. You know, if you have a community meeting, it looks like this. Your submittal application needs to be this. Instead of repeating that, we can pull that all up into kind of, here's your general procedures, and then down in each application, you can say, you know, you need to follow steps 1, 2, and 3. You do need to do a pre-application per the language above. Then if you ever have a, you know, if you're addressing that in one section and you didn't catch it in the other, it's consistent throughout. So one thing that we can look at anyway is just reorganizing that a little bit to simplify.
And so that kind of includes, like, this is everything your application needs to include by, like, say you're the first meeting with planning and zoning, and this is what you'd need by council or whatever?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Are you, or will we have help then, I guess, will Rachel have help then with, like, the applications and the actual, like, physical documents that we're requiring, because those probably need to be updated too?
Yeah, I can't remember if that was in our scope. I think it was. We always add that as an optional task to update checklists, so we'll look at our scope on that one.
Okay.
Oh, this is our favorite one because it's very simple but necessary. Removing reference to number of copies. It's all electronic now, so we just need to make sure that, you know, we're not saying you need 5 copies. I've actually gotten into some codes recently that talk about submitting applications on a, like, 3.5-inch floppy disk, and I'm like, we haven't seen those in 20 years or however long. So we'll remove we'll remove any of that language. It's all electronic submittals now. So we'd like to talk about separating site plans into a minor and major, and I think you've all seen that a lot lately with some of these site plans. It could be a very simple administrative process, wouldn't need to come through this whole body, whereas other applications certainly should come through the full hearing process. So we'll take a look at that and kind of propose some options for that, and we can kind of talk through that. Consider adding alternative criteria approval of administrative adjustments and special exceptions, so just kind of cleaning up some of those sections. We always want to look at the variance and appeals process, and here we're talking specifically about variances, but we just want to make sure they're working okay. We're hoping that, by updating the code, you're going to see less variances, but you're always going to still see them. So we want to make sure that it's really clearly spelled out how you get through that process and what the criteria of approval is. And then there's some historic preservation. We've talked about maybe creating a new section for historic preservation, just building in some real baseline standards. So, how you would look at a certificate of alteration for a historic structure, how you would establish a historic structure, those types of things. So we can talk about that a little bit more when we get into it, but we can kind of create a framework and then decide how much of that we want to include.
Can you talk a little bit more about number 6? I feel like it's pretty important. So is that talking about having administrative approvals for things or special exceptions so they don't come to planning and zoning necessarily first and then come to city council?
Yeah.
Is that the idea
Michaela
behind
has
that?
the language right here, so we're gonna.
So right now, I believe that the administrative adjustments are tied in with the variance language, and so our recommendation was to separate those out for clarity.
Okay.
And have their own subsection.
Thank you.
Not sure what happened to my mic, but I talk loud enough. I guess I'm talking too much, but it just makes me think of the encroachment permit, and can we add that to our list?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Great. Any other thoughts on this one? There's a lot of good stuff in this chapter now, so it's just, making sure it's really user-friendly and any of the criteria is really specifically called out. Flood damage prevention is in Chapter 7. I believe it's called flood damage prevention now, and we'd like to update the title to floodplain regulations, which is a little bit more standard. And then there's just a little bit of cleanup for the most part, maybe some reorganization so that it's a little bit more clear. Like I said before, these really follow the FEMA standards, so we don't want to stray from that at all, but we want to make sure that it's clear and concise and easy to read. Pretty technical, actually. There are several appendices, and we've looked at maybe removing Appendix A through F and moving the contents to the city website. I believe those were the checklists, correct? Or, no, that's the signature blocks. I don't have your code memorized yet, so.
The permits, agreements, and applications.
And then just some future considerations. These were identified mostly in the housing action plan. So just looking at inclusionary zoning, I don't know that we're necessarily ready to be talking about that quite yet, but just thinking about some future recommendations. And then short-term rentals. We did hear quite a bit about short-term rentals in our listening sessions, and maybe providing just that baseline, kind of like the historic preservation standards, just setting the stage for it. So maybe there's not any specific regulation yet. Maybe, maybe the city's not even tracking permits quite yet, but we're setting that foundation for when the trigger happens, and maybe even kind of building a little policy document for you to say, if you start to see, it goes this direction, this is when you're going to want to kind of put this in place. Inclusionary zoning is the same. We can provide kind of a guidebook, so to speak, of what the questions are that you would need to ask yourselves if you did want to and go down that road. And then, as you feel that it's time, or, maybe now is the time and we need to discuss that, but then you can kind of have some documentation to kind of move forward with that.
I mean, to me, it feels like short-term rentals is here, and it feels like sooner than later. That's just my opinion, that rather than say, oh, this is a trigger that might come up a few years from now, I think it's kind of a thing that we really don't address well.
Yeah, I agree. Did you guys pull any data on that? Like, because that's one thing that bothers me about short-term rentals is that, like, we don't permit them, so we don't know how many there are, and it's kind of this, like, wishy-washy area. And I know we've talked a lot about figuring out ways to, like, incentivize long-term rentals. I don't know if that's something you've seen other places in land use codes,
Yeah.
and what creative measures can be used for that. I'd be interested to learn.
And I think that's definitely a conversation and a kind of something we need to work through. I think right now probably isn't the time, because I'm sure we've put a lot on Rachel. But I think that is something that we need to continue to discuss and then develop rules around, you know, maybe as soon as this is passed or something, you know, kind of that be the next phase of land use.
When we were discussing this in P&Z some time ago, we were talking about accessory units, and we raised the question, should accessory units be allowed to be short-term rentals? So we have discussed it in the past, because if we're trying to get more housing for people who live and work here, if we're going to give people a break and let them have an accessory unit, should that be allowed to be short-term? So just look into it, yeah.
From an insurance perspective, short-term rentals, if they're strictly short-term rentals and the owners do not sleep there one night a year, we treat it as a business and not a personal policy.
Are you requiring business permits or business licenses for those or not? Okay. Okay, okay.
But I know this is like, I feel like that when we talked about the accessory dwelling units, that we sort of got to the same point where we're like, this is a much larger conversation than the scope that we've been at. But I do like the idea of at least like including, like you said, that framework and acknowledgement that that does exist in our community.
Good. And we have a ton of community examples of how other communities are handling the ADU, short-term rental kind of conversation. So we can even just kind of bring those forward and, you know, for a discussion, and maybe they just leave in, you know, maybe they just sit in that discussion realm for now, but we can totally bring those forward, so.
Yeah, I think we would all appreciate even just that information.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. All right, so that's kind of what we have pulled together for the assessment piece of all the different chapters and topics we've talked about. We kind of wanted to lay out how we anticipate drafting this now. So like we said before, we really want to dive into zoning districts and use regulations first. I think they really set the foundation for most of the rest of the decisions we need to make within this code. The general provisions, we're trying to pull some of these other pieces in, just kind of, that could go anywhere, but I thought that would kind of help round out that first module, kind of dive into those general provisions and into the zone districts and uses and have that conversation together. Module 2, we could get into subdivision standards, site development standards, and pull in the historic preservation. And then Module 3 would be application procedures, floodplain regulations, definitions, and appendices. What we've kind of tried to do here is each module is going to have one kind of big piece. So the zoning and uses is our big piece in Module 1. Our site development standards is kind of that big piece in Module 2. And then application procedures in Module 3. I like to do application procedures towards the end, because then we've kind of fleshed out all of the other issues, and then we really know how we can get our heads into any changes that we need to make within that. So any questions on kind of how this will lay out?
My just thought was the possibility of moving definitions further up. It's one of the weaknesses in our current code is not having all of our terminology defined.
Yeah.
I think that could help tighten up some of the other.
So I probably should have just put definitions in all three, because we will be addressing definitions as we go. But in Module 3 is where we'll have to do the final cleanup and make sure we had everything compiled. So, yes, yeah.
And then
Yeah,
as
you'll
far,
get sick of definitions by the end.
then as far as zoning distance, I really recently came up with a glitch in our system, as I pointed out to planning. We have on our zoning map something called light industrial, but we do not have a light industrial zone. So if you could take a look at the map that has that little piece on there.
Okay,
And it's
yeah.
it's not far from Carpenter's, what it says light industrial on the map, but we don't have a light industrial
have it.
zone, so good luck.
Okay, good.
Okay, before I get into these modules, it's
Yeah.
just one last thought about like subdivision standards. I was just thinking like, if for somehow we still have land that has the ability to do a major subdivision, just thinking about requiring alley access for like trash pickup, because I know there's still some places in the community where like refuse has to be picked up in the front. You know, and I just trying to think about our employees there, that like that's probably not ideal for everybody, and just make sure we kind of incorporate alleys. I don't know if that's already required or.
Okay.
And then with these modules, like, are we gonna have work sessions with you after each module or during the modules, or?
Yeah, I believe we've set it up with a work session at the end of each module. We have an advisory committee that we're kicking off engagement with them starting tomorrow, and they'll be kind of workshopping with us throughout, and I believe a couple of you are on that advisory committee for consistency and cross-pollination, so to speak. So yeah, we'll work with them 2 or 3 times throughout each module to kind of review. So what we'll do is, the first meeting is usually bringing them examples and kind of the concepts and ideas. And then from that, we'll make some decisions on some of those items, go back to the drawing board with the language, bring them some draft language, review that, and then kind of a final draft, and then that's what comes to you all. So you'll have we'll have an opportunity to workshop those at the end of each module, so that when we get to the very end and consolidate everything and have the final document, none of it will be new to you. You'll say, you know, we've talked about this already. We talked about this, and I see you added it. We talked about this other thing. I see you deleted it. Great. You know, we can kind of check that off as we go. So.
And just to give a summary to any public that might be interested in participating, or what are ways the public can participate in these modules?
Yeah, so one thing that we'd like to do throughout this process is anytime we identify, I'm going to use short-term rentals as an example. I know because we just were talking about it. If we have specific kind of questions that we can quantify and push back out to the community, we definitely will. So anywhere that we can say, you know, we've been talking about this, you know, as a group, and some of this is just very technical and just kind of needs to be figured out. And then some things we really do need that full public feedback on. So we have a few touch points throughout the process where we can bring those forward in a questionnaire format and potentially an open house or a small group forum. You know, maybe sometimes what we've found successful is maybe that topic is specific to a group, say landscape standards. You know, we want to get maybe someone with good landscape knowledge or installation knowledge or plant knowledge, and then development knowledge, kind of all wrapped up, and we have a good kind of work session on that to workshop which direction it needs to go. So I have found those focus groups to be really helpful in kind of moving things forward, and then just general public engagement. We will also post each module as it's complete, kind of basically when it comes to you all for a work session. We'll have to decide whether we want to do it after the work session or before. Obviously, it becomes a public document once it comes through to you in that work session format, but we can also post it on we use a program called Conveo that just kind of allows the public to kind of mark up questions or thoughts throughout the whole document. So we would potentially put that out after each module, and then the final draft would go out in that format as well. So, and we can either have that, usually we have the comments hidden from, you know, if you were to comment, you wouldn't be able to see Michaela's comments, but we would see them all, so.
Yeah, I really like that, and I just, you know, want to reiterate to anyone in here or listening that we really do want participation and input. So, yeah, thank you.
I think that's a great opportunity for us to include something in the water bill after each of these modules come out, and just remind people that that's an option to provide feedback.
Absolutely. Or any events. I know summer's kind of wrapping up, but, you know, any holiday events that kind of come up as we're finishing Module 1, and then as we move into next year, any public events. And, you know, it's very easy for us to create a quick little note card with a QR code that just leads you directly to that Conveo document or the website. So we definitely want to we really want everyone to be reviewing this and providing feedback. I can't tell you how many times we sit in a group like this and we all think we have it figured out. You send the draft out and someone says, well, what about that one thing? And you go, oh yeah, we didn't think about that. So it's always great to have those, you know, constructive comments.
Well,
Will the final document just be electronic, or will this be a hard copy, or what do you see the final
It
product
should
being?
just be electronic.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions kind of on the module breakdown? All right, so next steps, like I said, we're going to kick off our first advisory committee meeting tomorrow. We'll go through a very similar exercise as tonight, just kind of bringing the advisory committee up to speed on what we've learned so far and where we think we're headed. And then we'll start drafting Module 1 pretty much any day now. Any focus groups or kind of outreach that we need to have throughout the fall as we start to identify topics that would be great to put back out to the community, we'll do that. And then as you see here, we have work sessions with you all again. We could do another joint work session. We could do separate. We're open to whatever seems to work the best. And that will be looking at Module 1. And then Module 2 will be drafted primarily over the winter. Module 3 kind of into spring. And then hopefully we can be moving towards adoption kind of early next summer. So about a year from now, a little less. All right, any questions on anything else or any other thoughts you've come up with?
Is the advisory committee, can members of the public still join that, or is that like a solidified group?
It's an established group, but Rachel, do you want to comment on the advisory committee?
Oh, I was just asking if if members of the public can join the advisory committee, or if that's already like an established group.
Thank you. I think that is the end of our presentation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you so much for your time and your efforts. This is a really great process, and I'm really excited about it, and I think we're going to do good for the community, hopefully.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate the additional feedback you all gave us this evening. Every time we have these meetings, a little more clarity comes into the process. So thank you all so much for your time.
All right, sorry for the confusion, but we're going to finish council's workshop here at the table because our mics are here, and then I'll end this session, and then, we'll start our regular meeting up there. Okay, so we're going to move on to B on our workshop agenda, which is general council discussion. Do any council members have a topic they'd like to bring up or any discussion? Okay, seeing none, we'll end the work session and we'll start our regular meeting in 15 minutes at 7:30.